There is a general assumption in British politics that the Ukraine war, however tragic and unfortunate, is going to end quite soon. I think this may very well be entirely wrong. This may be a war that we are stuck with for 5 or even 10 years. And what I want to do is to look at the implications for British politics of that being true. This began with the happenstance of seeing the new Oscar-nominated film All Quiet on the Western Front, which is both a really gory, graphic war film of a traditional kind, but is also really a film about how wars end and how they end badly. And of course, the 1914-18 war ended very badly in terms of the rise of Hitler and fascism and what happened in Russia. It was a ragged, brutal, ghastly ending to that war. And it's very similar to what we see going on in Ukraine at the moment, where we are back with trench warfare and tank warfare, things that optimists had thought were left for the history books. And I've been thinking more and more and more, not only about when this war ends, but about how it ends, because it's very, very hard to see a clean ending. I think the most interesting piece of journalism on all of that recently was actually our own Bruno Macias's interview with Alexei Danilov, who's Kiev's national security advisor. And Danilov told Bruno that he thought there were 2 possible things to talk about in terms of the ending. One was the possibility, which he clearly fears, of some kind of behind-the-scenes negotiations between Moscow and Washington, which would be about some kind of partition of Ukraine, a kind of frozen DMZ, a bit like Korea, where the 2 sides would just come to a halt.
This battle cannot be frozen or postponed. It cannot be ignored.
And so if there's some kind of talks which result in the partitioning of Ukraine, and Zelensky has failed to deliver on his promise of all Ukraine, and that's our project, then I think he is in great danger. His administration is in danger and might fall, might splinter. And that's the moment that Moscow thinks, aha, we're on the front foot, we can win this.
All of us, millions of Ukrainians, wish the same: victory. Only victory.
Now, the other thing that Danilov said was that Russia is going to carry on being an imperialistic, expansionist power until it is properly reformed. And he argued that modern Russia is itself a colonial power which has to break up further before it can be reformed. And that is something that the Kremlin, of course, would totally reject. And therefore, I don't see an end to the war that way. This is not going to be a war that ends with total victory for one side, unless the Russians suddenly push through and destroy Ukraine entirely, a huge victory for them and a huge defeat for the West. Because on the other side, nobody is suggesting we're going to march on Moscow and that the Kremlin is going to fall and that the Russian state is going to be defeated in a military way. Nobody thinks that. It's a nuclear-powered, very, very powerful state. That's not going to happen. So it can't be victory for Kiev and it can't be victory for Moscow anytime soon. So what's the answer? There isn't an answer. So if you try and turn this back to domestic British politics, you've got a Conservative Party which still deep down thinks that at some point before too long we're going to be able to get taxes down, the economy is going to recover, and that's their future. And you've got a Labour Party that thinks at some point quite soon the war and stuff will end, inflation will come down, and they will again be able to spend more on public services. That might simply be wrong. This war could mean the end of what we experienced as globalization around the turn of the century. More and more abundance, lower and lower prices. Very, very open economies, an open world we could travel whenever we wanted, wherever we wanted. That world may be ending. We may be going through a period where, because of disruption to global supply lines, actually food prices carry on growing. Food remains very, very expensive. Energy remains very, very expensive and constrains the ability either of governments with the right to cut taxes and shrink the state. I think the state is going to carry on getting bigger and bigger and bigger, but also the ability of the left to spend much more heavily on social programmes.
Last week, the Defence Secretary said the armed forces have faced what he called a consistent hollowing out under Labour and early Conservative governments.
If the Right Honourable Gentleman opposite wants to be the next Secretary of Defence, Service, who should come here and get off his chest the shortcomings that his former government did. I'm happy to say that we have hollowed out and underfunded. Will he do the same?
I was talking to Lord Dannatt, formerly General Sir Richard Dannatt, Chief of the General Staff, and in charge, therefore, of the army. And I said to him, the Americans, reportedly and anonymously, are saying that Britain is no longer a Tier 1 military country, and we're barely in Tier 2, and that the British Army cannot really defend this country or indeed any of its allies. And to my absolute surprise, Richard Dannatt said he thought that was broadly right.
The Army's aspiration has always been to field a war-fighting division. It cannot do so today.
He thought that what had happened to the Army was really devastating. Years and years and years of cuts. When I started reporting politics, there were about 100,000 soldiers in the British Army. And people kept saying, it's not going to fall below 100,000. And then it was, it's not going to fall below 90,000. And then it was, it's not going to fall below 80,000. And now we're to 70,000 and falling fast. And it's not just the numbers, it's the fact that the army no longer provides the kind of career, the money and the protections that people want. People don't want to join the armed forces anymore. More are leaving than are joining. So there is a really big problem inside the British Armed Forces.
Nuclear fusion as the driving force behind the world's arsenal of nuclear weapons has become a major source of fear and controversy.
What does it mean for us? And I think the best parallel is look back at the worst years of the Cold War, because that's what it would feel like. And at that time, of course, we had a much, much bigger military, much stronger armed forces. We had a more aggressively surveillance and security state. We were all consumed by terror about the possibility of a nuclear attack. All of those things might be coming back. And we might be looking back at the last 10 or 15 years of our politics, not as a period of strangely right-wing governments, but actually a period of heedless consumerism, the kind of dancing before the dark times. That may be where we're heading. It has huge implications for Labour thinking, and it's got huge implications, of course, for the Tories as well. And I think it's just weird that we are not having this conversation at all as a society right now, because it's right in front of us, this war. There's no way for it to end very quickly. So why aren't we talking about that?